My name is Isabella Duarte. I'm 31 years old, and 5 weeks ago at my cousin's baby shower, my Aunt Paulette told nearly 25 relatives, including our elderly great-uncle, that I'd manipulated Grandma into signing a will that cut everyone else out, and that I was basically a liar and a thief hiding behind a piece of paper. She didn't know that the attorney who oversaw the signing had, per his firm's standard practice for elderly clients without immediate next of kin present, recorded the entire session on video, start to finish, with my grandmother speaking clearly and independently about every single decision in that document. I didn't argue with Paulette at the shower. I just finished my slice of cake, congratulated my cousin, and drove home knowing exactly what was sitting on a flash drive in my desk drawer. To understand why I stayed so calm, you need to go back 8 months, to the week my grandmother first called her attorney, entirely on her own, without me anywhere in the room. Before I get into it, if you're new here, take a second to subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Drop the word recorded in the comments if you've ever had the truth documented in a way nobody expected, right when you needed it most. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to where this actually started, because you need the full picture before any of what happened at that shower makes sense. My grandmother Corazon Duarte is 82, a retired seamstress who raised 4 children largely on her own after my grandfather passed when my mother, her youngest, was only 6. She ran a small alteration shop out of the front room of her house for nearly 30 years, and I still remember as a child, sitting on the floor surrounded by fabric scraps while she worked, humming old songs in Tagalog under her breath, occasionally handing me a spool of thread to keep me occupied. I'm the daughter of that youngest child, and for reasons that have more to do with geography and circumstance than any deliberate favoritism, I ended up being the grandchild who lived closest to her for most of my adult life, a 15-minute drive, compared to Paulette's 90 minutes, and my other aunts and uncles scattered even further across the state. I visited most weekends, took her to doctor's appointments, when my mother's own health made long drives difficult, and generally became, over the years, the person Grandma called first whenever something needed handling, whether that meant a broken garbage disposal or a confusing letter from her insurance company. I want to be clear about something before I go further, because I think it matters for understanding everything that happened afterward. I never asked to be that person. It simply happened, gradually, the way certain roles settle onto whichever family member happens to be closest, both geographically and emotionally, when someone starts needing more help than they used to. Paulette, I should say clearly, wasn't absent by choice. Her 90-minute drive, combined with Marco's demanding medical schedule, made frequent visits genuinely difficult in a way I never once resented, understanding as I did how much of her own time and energy went into managing her son's care. 8 months ago, my grandmother's longtime family physician retired, and during the transition to a new doctor, a series of routine tests revealed early-stage kidney disease, manageable with the right care, but serious enough that it prompted her, entirely on her own initiative, to start thinking seriously about her affairs for the first time in years. She called me one Tuesday evening, her voice steady and practical in the way it always was when she'd decided something needed doing. "Isabella, I want to update my will. The one I have is 15 years old and doesn't reflect things the way I want them anymore. Can you help me find a good attorney?" I offered to research a few options and let her choose, which she did, selecting a state attorney named Gerald Okonkwo based on a recommendation from a friend at her church. What I didn't do, and want to be explicit about, is attend the actual meetings where she discussed the contents of the will itself. I drove her to 2 appointments, sat in the waiting room both times, and was specifically, deliberately, not present for either substantive conversation about what she wanted the document to say. Gerald's office has a firm policy, I later learned, of meeting with elderly clients privately regarding the actual terms of estate documents without family members present, specifically to protect against exactly the kind of undue influence accusation that would later get leveled against me. My grandmother finalized her will roughly 6 weeks after that first phone call, on a rainy Thursday afternoon in early spring, according to the date stamped on the document itself. I didn't know its contents until the day it was formally read, months later, after her health took a harder turn than any of us expected. I remember in the weeks between the signing and her passing, occasionally wondering idly what she'd decided, but never once asking her directly, since it felt like exactly the kind of question a grandchild shouldn't press an aging grandmother about. I should explain what happened to her health, because it matters for the timeline of everything that followed. About 4 months ago, a routine follow-up revealed her kidney function had declined faster than her new doctor anticipated, and after a difficult month of appointments and difficult conversations, she made the decision, again largely on her own, to decline aggressive dialysis in favor of comfort-focused care, understanding clearly what that decision meant for her remaining time. She passed away 7 weeks ago, peacefully, at home, with several of us present, myself included. The will was read 17 days after the funeral, at Gerald's office, with all 4 of her children and several grandchildren present, myself among them. The term surprised almost everyone in that room, myself included, more than most people believe when I tell this story. My grandmother had left her modest house, paid off decades earlier, along with the bulk of her savings, to a trust structured specifically to fund my younger cousin Marco's ongoing medical care. Marco has a chronic condition requiring expensive, continuous treatment, and my Aunt Paulette, his mother, had struggled for years with the financial strain of his care, something my grandmother had apparently watched with real concern in her final years. The remainder of the estate, modest jewelry and a few sentimental items, was divided among her other grandchildren, myself included, in equal, unremarkable shares. I want to be honest that even I was somewhat surprised by the specific structure of the trust, though not by the underlying generosity toward Marco, which felt entirely consistent with how much Grandma had always worried about him. What surprised Paulette, apparently, was different and much angrier. She'd expected, she said later, a more traditional division of the estate among her and her siblings directly, rather than a trust specifically earmarked for her son's medical expenses, administered not by her, but by a court-appointed trustee, with clear, restricted spending guidelines. Paulette's reaction in that reading room was immediate and sharp. She turned to me specifically rather than to Gerald or to her own siblings, and asked, pointedly, whether I'd had anything to do with the will's unusual structure, given how close I'd been to Grandma in her final years. I told her, honestly, that I hadn't been present for any of the substantive discussions about the will's contents, that I'd simply driven her to appointments, and that this was the first time I was hearing the actual terms myself. Paulette didn't seem to believe me, though she said little more in the room itself, likely out of respect for the setting. What I didn't know, in that reading room, was that Gerald's firm had a practice I'd never previously encountered, one he explained to me privately about 10 days later, after Paulette had begun making calls to other family members suggesting, with increasing specificity, that I'd manipulated an elderly, ailing woman into cutting most of her children out of a traditional inheritance. Gerald called me to his office and explained that for elderly clients navigating significant estate decisions, particularly those involving unconventional structures like the trust for Marco, his firm's standard practice, adopted years earlier after an unrelated dispute at another client's estate, was to record the entire signing session on video, not the private consultations beforehand, which remained confidential, but the final signing itself, where the attorney reviews the complete document aloud with the client, confirms their understanding of each provision, and asks a series of standard questions designed specifically to establish testamentary capacity and freedom from undue influence. "I'm telling you this," Gerald said, "because I've heard secondhand that some family members are suggesting you influenced your grandmother's decisions. I want you to know this recording exists and that it clearly shows your grandmother explaining her own reasoning for the trust, unprompted, in her own words, with no one else in the room but the two of us." I asked whether I could see it. He explained that as a beneficiary named in the will, I had a legitimate interest in the estate's documentation, and that he could, with appropriate release forms, provide me a copy for my own records, particularly given the specific accusations apparently circulating. I signed the release the same day. I watched the recording alone in my apartment that evening. 41 minutes of footage from a static camera mounted in the corner of Gerald's conference room. It showed my grandmother, dressed in the pale blue cardigan I remembered her wearing to church most Sundays, sitting across from Gerald at his desk, answering his questions in the same steady, practical voice I'd heard on that first Tuesday phone call 8 months earlier. I remember pausing the video at one point, just to sit with the sight of her, animated and clear-eyed, in a way that felt different from how I'd grown used to seeing her in those final, difficult months. Gerald asked her, on camera, to explain in her own words why she'd chosen to structure the estate the way she had. My grandmother, without hesitation, explained that she'd watched Paulette struggle for years covering Marco's medical bills, that she'd overheard, more than once, Paulette crying on the phone to a hospital billing department, and that she wanted to make certain, in a way no one could later undo or redirect, that Marco's care would be provided for regardless of what happened with the rest of the family's finances. She specifically mentioned, unprompted, that she trusted a court-appointed trustee more than any individual family member to manage the money responsibly for exactly the purpose she intended. Because money has a way of getting spent on other things, even with the best intentions, and I've watched that happen in this family before. Gerald asked her, directly, on camera, whether anyone had pressured her or suggested this structure to her. She said, plainly, looking straight at the camera without any hesitation, "No one suggested this. This is entirely my own decision. My granddaughter Isabella doesn't even know what's in this will. I haven't discussed the specifics with any of my grandchildren." Gerald asked if she wanted to change anything before signing. She said no, and signed each page methodically, the same careful signature I recognized from birthday cards she'd sent me for 31 years, pausing once to ask Gerald to repeat a clause about the trustee's spending authority, listening carefully to his explanation before nodding and continuing. I sat with that recording for a long time after it ended, feeling a complicated mix of grief and vindication that I hadn't expected to feel simultaneously. Part of me wished, fiercely, that I'd never needed this kind of proof at all, that my family could simply have trusted my honesty without requiring a video recording to confirm it. Another part of me felt an enormous quiet relief that the proof existed at all, given how quickly Paulette's accusations had started spreading through calls to relatives I hadn't spoken with in years. A second cousin in Arizona, an old family friend from church. People who now, I imagined, had some version of me in their heads as someone capable of manipulating a dying grandmother for money. I didn't share the recording immediately. I want to be honest about why. Part of me still hoped Paulette's accusations would simply fade on their own, once the initial shock of the will's contents settled, and grief did what grief eventually does to sharp edges. That hope lasted until my cousin's baby shower, 5 weeks ago, a warm, pastel-decorated gathering in my aunt's backyard, with paper streamers and a table full of tiny onesies people had brought as gifts. When Paulette, standing near the gift table with our elderly great-uncle and several other relatives, said the sentence I opened this story with, that I'd manipulated Grandma into signing a will that cut everyone else out, and that I was basically a liar and a thief, hiding behind a piece of paper. I want to describe the specific feeling of hearing that because I think it matters. It wasn't quite anger, not immediately. It was something closer to a strange, disorienting grief, hearing someone I'd known my entire life describe me, confidently, to people who'd known me since childhood, as someone capable of manipulating a dying woman for money, in the middle of what was supposed to be a happy celebration for new life entering the family. Our great-uncle looked genuinely troubled, clearly unsure what to believe, glancing between Paulette and me like he was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of a person he thought he knew. I finished my cake, congratulated my cousin on the baby shower, and left shortly after, driving home with the quiet, settled resolve of someone who'd finally run out of patience for hoping a lie would simply dissolve on its own. I called Gerald the next morning and asked him directly what my options were for sharing the recording with the rest of the family, given that the accusations had now become public enough to warrant a clear, documented response, rather than continued private patience. He explained that since I was a named beneficiary, and the recording didn't contain any information legally restricted from disclosure, I was free to share my own copy however I saw fit, though he gently suggested doing so calmly, through a family meeting rather than a public confrontation, given how raw everyone's grief clearly still was. I organized a small gathering at my mother's house the following weekend, inviting Paulette, my mother, my other aunt and uncle, and Marco, who was old enough now, at 19, to understand what was actually being discussed about his own medical trust. I didn't frame it as a confrontation. I told them honestly over coffee my mother had made too strong out of nervousness, that given the accusations that had been circulating, I thought it was important for everyone to see exactly what Grandma had said, in her own words, about her own decisions, rather than continuing to speculate. I played the recording on my laptop, the room silent except for my grandmother's steady voice explaining, clearly and independently, why she'd structured things the way she had. I watched Paulette's face throughout, the same complicated recalculation I imagine my own face had gone through weeks earlier, watching someone she'd accused publicly explain herself with a clarity that left very little room for alternate interpretation. My Uncle Ramon, who'd mostly stayed neutral throughout the whole ordeal, shook his head slowly partway through, murmuring, "That's Mom, all right, stubborn as ever, doing exactly what she wanted." When it finished, Paulette was quiet for a long moment, staring at the now dark laptop screen. "I didn't know that recording existed," she finally said, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in the 5 weeks since the shower. "I don't know what I thought happened, honestly. I think I just needed someone to blame, because it hurt so much that she didn't structure things the way I expected, and you were the easiest person to be angry at. You were always the one closest to her. It was easier to imagine you'd taken something from me than to sit with the idea that Mom looked at my life, at Marco's bills, and decided on her own that this was what she needed to do." I told her I understood the hurt, genuinely, since I imagine watching your own mother direct significant resources toward your child's medical care, rather than to you directly, carries its own complicated grief even alongside the gratitude, a strange, tangled feeling of being both deeply cared for and somehow bypassed at the same time. What I couldn't accept, I told her, was being called a liar and a thief in front of people who'd known me my entire life, based on nothing more than a guess about who was easiest to blame. Marco, who'd been quiet through most of the recording, spoke up near the end, his voice unsteady in a way that made the whole room go still. "Grandma did this for me," he said. "I didn't know that. I don't know what I thought, honestly, but I didn't know she'd thought about it this specifically. I thought maybe it was just easier for the lawyers to set it up that way, not that she'd actually sat there and said all that." Paulette reached over and took his hand, and I watched something shift in her expression, the anger giving way, slowly, to something more like the grief she'd probably been carrying underneath it the entire time. 5 weeks have passed since that baby shower. Paulette called me 2 days after the family meeting and apologized directly, without qualification, for what she'd said at the shower, acknowledging that she'd spread accusations to other relatives before ever bothering to ask me a single direct question. She's since called several of those same relatives to correct the record, a small, deliberate effort at repair that I've genuinely appreciated, even if it hasn't fully erased the discomfort of those 5 weeks. My relationship with Paulette remains careful, still rebuilding in the slow, ordinary way trust rebuilds after something like this, conversation by conversation, rather than in any single dramatic moment. Marco and I have grown closer, oddly, in the aftermath. He's asked me more than once about Grandma's final months, wanting to understand a version of her I got to know that his own difficult health journey had kept him somewhat separate from. I think about that baby shower sometimes, standing there while my aunt called me a liar and a thief in front of people who'd known me my whole life. I don't feel real anger toward her anymore, even after that. I think Paulette was grieving in the specific, complicated way people grieve when a parent's final decisions don't match the story they'd always told themselves about their place in the family. And I think it was easier in that raw moment to direct that grief at me than to sit with the harder truth that her mother had seen a need in her own family that she hadn't been able to fully address herself, and had quietly decided, on her own, to address it in a way none of us fully expected. I've thought, too, about how differently this could have gone if Gerald's firm hadn't happened to have that recording policy in place. Without it, this would have simply become one version of events against another, my word against Paulette's suspicion, indefinitely unresolved, poisoning family gatherings for years the way these things sometimes do. There's something both comforting and slightly unsettling in that thought, the recognition that the truth, in this case, depended on a procedural habit I had no part in creating, a policy adopted at some other client's dispute long before my grandmother ever walked into that office. I've become genuinely grateful for a kind of institutional carefulness I never used to think much about, the quiet, unglamorous systems that exist specifically to protect people like my grandmother, and by extension, people like me, from exactly this kind of aftermath. My relationship with Paulette remains careful, still rebuilding in the slow, ordinary way trust rebuilds after something like this, conversation by conversation, rather than in any single dramatic moment. We had dinner together, just the two of us, about 2 weeks ago, the first time in years we'd spent time alone without the rest of the family around, and she told me, quietly, that she'd started seeing a grief counselor, partly to process losing her mother, and partly, she admitted, to understand why she'd needed so badly to believe the worst about me in those first raw weeks. I told her I appreciated her doing that work, and that I hoped in time we could get back to something resembling the relationship we'd had before any of this happened. If you're watching this and someone has ever accused you of something you didn't do, especially in a moment of shared grief where the truth felt too fragile to defend loudly, I want you to hear this, because I spent weeks hoping the accusation would simply fade, rather than needing to be answered directly. And I've learned that some lies don't fade, they just wait for someone else to repeat them. You don't need to raise your voice to correct the record. Sometimes the truth is sitting quietly on a flash drive somewhere, recorded by someone who understood, better than any of us at the time, exactly how much that proof might someday matter. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about a time you were accused of something untrue and finally found the proof that cleared your name. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. New stories go up every week here on The Quiet Reckoning. There's another one waiting for you, about a woman whose brother swore she'd forged their father's signature on a business contract, 3 years before a forensic handwriting expert proved whose signature it actually belonged to.